The room did not fall silent because anyone asked it to. It fell silent because something heavy had entered the space. Inside the congressional chamber, the kind of quiet settled that only comes before impact. Chairs creaked as lawmakers adjusted their posture. A few aides stopped whispering mid-sentence. Camera operators steadied their lenses, sensing instinctively that this was not going to be another forgettable hearing buried in government archives. This was going to be a moment. At the center of the room, under unforgiving lights that exposed every blink and breath, two women sat facing one another across a long, polished table that had witnessed decades of political battles. But this one felt different. This one carried consequences. On one side sat Pam Bondi, a woman who had spent years navigating the highest corridors of power. She arrived not just with credentials, but with confidence sharpened by loyalty. As a former U.S. Attorney General aligned closely with Donald Trump, Bondi was no stranger to confrontation. She had defended presidents, corporations, and political allies with unwavering commitment. Her posture reflected that history. Shoulders back. Chin raised. Hands resting calmly as though the outcome was already decided. She carried herself like someone accustomed to control, someone who believed the law bent naturally toward those who knew how to wield it. To Bondi, authority was armor, and she wore it well. Across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a presence that contrasted sharply with Bondi's polished certainty. Crockett did not come wrapped in the insulation of elite political machinery. Her path had been different, built in courtrooms, communities, and hard conversations where power was rarely on her side. She represented people who did not have lobbyists whispering in their ears or legal teams waiting on standby. Workers. Families. Communities pushed to the margins. Crockett's strength did not come from proximity to power but from confrontation with injustice. She sat upright, composed, eyes focused, her stillness carrying a quiet intensity that suggested preparation rather than hesitation. The tension between them was immediate and unmistakable. Bondi radiated expectation, the confidence of someone prepared to instruct, correct, and dominate the narrative. Crockett, by contrast, radiated patience. She was not there to perform. She was there to respond. Around them, lawmakers sensed the collision forming. This hearing was not about procedural technicalities or ceremonial debate. It was about interpretation. About purpose. About who the law truly served. Bondi arrived intent on defending a system that protected the powerful, while Crockett came prepared to challenge that very foundation. The law sat at the center of the table between them, not as text on paper, but as a battleground. As microphones flickered to life and the session formally began, the atmosphere grew heavier. Bondi's gaze swept the room briefly before settling on Crockett, calculating, confident. Crockett remained still, waiting. This was not simply an exchange of arguments. It was a test of vision. Would the law be framed as a shield for wealth and influence, or as a safeguard for the public? Everyone in the room felt the stakes rising, because this confrontation represented more than two opposing viewpoints. It represented a fracture running through the heart of the nation itself. And when Pam Bondi leaned forward to speak, the sound of her voice shattered the silence and signaled the opening strike of a battle that would not be easily forgotten. Pam Bondi did not ease into her remarks. The moment the floor was hers, she claimed it with the certainty of someone who believed the room belonged to her. Her voice was firm, deliberate, and sharpened by years of standing behind podiums where challenge was rare and deference was expected. She leaned toward the microphone, eyes fixed on Jasmine Crockett, and spoke not as if entering a discussion, but as if issuing a correction. From her opening sentence, it was clear she had no intention of acknowledging Crockett as an equal participant. This was not debate in Bondi's mind. This was instruction. She questioned Crockett's understanding of legal principles without naming specifics, cloaking her dismissal in broad statements meant to sound authoritative. Her tone carried an unmistakable message: you are out of your depth. Bondi framed herself as the adult in the room, the seasoned prosecutor who knew how the world really worked. According to her, the law was not some idealistic promise carved for fairness. It was a mechanism of order, one that required strong hands at the top to guide it. She spoke of real-world consequences, of economic stability, of national interests, using language designed to sound responsible while subtly narrowing who deserved protection under the law. As she continued, Bondi painted a picture of a nation that depended on corporate strength, political continuity, and executive authority to survive. She suggested that limits placed on powerful actors were not safeguards but threats. In her telling, accountability became recklessness, and scrutiny became sabotage. The law, she argued, must remain flexible for those entrusted with leadership. Her words were smooth, carefully arranged, and delivered with practiced confidence. To someone unfamiliar with legal nuance, it might have sounded persuasive. But to those listening closely, something felt off. The law she described did not resemble a system of justice. It resembled permission. Around the chamber, reactions varied. Some lawmakers nodded cautiously, recognizing familiar rhetoric that had dominated political discourse for years. Others stiffened, their expressions tightening as Bondi's framing grew increasingly aggressive. She spoke as though economic power and moral authority were inseparable, as though those at the top deserved insulation from the very rules that governed everyone else. Each sentence pushed the same underlying idea, that order depended on shielding the powerful from constraint. And with every word, she edged further away from the foundational purpose of the law itself. Throughout Bondi's remarks, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. She did not interrupt. She did not gesture or react visibly. Instead, she listened with full attention, her stillness growing more noticeable as Bondi's confidence expanded. Crockett was not disengaged, she was measuring. Every mischaracterization, every exaggerated claim, every moment where Bondi leaned on authority instead of substance was being catalogued. The contrast between them sharpened with each passing second. Bondi filled the room with volume and certainty. Crockett filled it with anticipation. Bondi eventually turned her dismissal into a direct accusation. She suggested that Crockett's perspective was driven by ideology rather than understanding, by emotion rather than experience. It was a familiar tactic, one often used to undermine voices that challenge entrenched power. By framing Crockett as political and herself as practical, Bondi attempted to claim neutrality while advancing a deeply partisan interpretation of the law. She concluded with a tone of finality, as if the matter had been settled simply because she had spoken last. When Bondi leaned back in her chair, her expression suggested satisfaction. She believed she had reasserted dominance. The room, however, told a different story. The silence that followed was not agreement. It was evaluation. Eyes drifted not back to Bondi, but toward Jasmine Crockett. The balance had begun to shift, not because Crockett had spoken yet, but because Bondi had revealed more than she intended. In trying to define the law as a shield for power, she had exposed the very weakness in her argument. And everyone could feel it. The moment was coming when Crockett would speak, and the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the reckoning. Jasmine Crockett did not respond immediately. She allowed the moment to stretch just long enough for the weight of Pam Bondi's words to settle across the chamber. That pause mattered. It created space, not for drama, but for clarity. When Crockett finally leaned forward, the movement was unhurried, intentional. She adjusted her microphone with steady hands, her expression composed, her gaze unwavering. There was no anger on her face, no urgency to defend herself. What followed would not be reaction. It would be correction. Her voice entered the room calmly, almost conversational, but every syllable carried precision. She did not raise her volume to match Bondi's. She did not mirror the aggression. Instead, she dismantled it. Crockett began by addressing the core assumption underlying Bondi's argument, that the law existed primarily to protect institutions of power. She stated plainly that this premise was wrong. Not misguided. Not debatable. Wrong. The law, she explained, was not designed as a privilege reserved for corporations, political insiders, or executive offices. It was designed as a restraint, a boundary placed precisely because unchecked power had historically caused harm. As she continued, Crockett translated complex legal principles into language that required no credentials to understand. She spoke about why statutes were written, who they were meant to serve, and how they had been applied over time. She pointed out where Bondi's interpretation stretched beyond legal precedent and drifted into convenience. Each example was delivered without sarcasm, without flourish, but with unmistakable authority. The effect was immediate. The room grew quieter, not out of shock, but out of focus. People were listening differently now. Crockett leaned slightly closer to the microphone as she addressed Bondi directly. She explained that invoking national security and economic stability did not grant immunity from accountability. Those concepts, she said, were not shields against scrutiny but responsibilities that demanded it. The law did not exist to make powerful actors comfortable. It existed to ensure they could not operate without consequence. Her words reframed the entire discussion. What Bondi had portrayed as strength, Crockett revealed as vulnerability. What had been framed as realism was exposed as avoidance. The contrast between the two women sharpened with every sentence. Bondi had relied on authority. Crockett relied on substance. Bondi had spoken as though the law belonged to those who governed. Crockett spoke as though the law belonged to everyone. She reminded the chamber that legal systems lose legitimacy the moment they are bent to protect the few at the expense of the many. That erosion, she warned, does not create stability. It creates distrust. And distrust, once rooted, is far more dangerous to a nation than accountability ever could be. At one point, Crockett paused and delivered a line that cut through the room with surgical precision. She suggested that anyone presenting the law as a personal defense mechanism rather than a public safeguard should revisit its foundations. The phrasing was restrained, but the message was unmistakable. It was not a personal insult. It was a professional indictment. A reminder that legal expertise is measured not by confidence, but by fidelity to principle. Pam Bondi shifted in her seat. It was subtle, but visible. Her earlier composure had begun to crack. Crockett's tone made interruption difficult. There was no emotional spike to attack, no exaggeration to dismiss. Just clarity, delivered steadily, leaving little room for rebuttal without distortion. Lawmakers exchanged glances. Some nodded almost imperceptibly. Others sat frozen, aware they were witnessing a reversal they had not anticipated. As Crockett concluded her remarks, she did not declare victory or seek applause. She simply reaffirmed the purpose of the law as a public trust. Her final words lingered, not because they were loud, but because they were difficult to ignore. When she leaned back, the room did not erupt. It settled. The shift was complete. The authority Bondi had claimed moments earlier now felt hollow, while Crockett's calm presence had redefined the conversation entirely. And in that stillness, it became clear that the burden of response had shifted. Bondi no longer held the floor. She was now the one being measured. The moments after Jasmine Crockett finished speaking carried a different kind of weight. This silence was not tense in the way it had been earlier. It was reflective, heavy with realization. Pam Bondi sat motionless for a beat longer than expected, her expression controlled but strained, as though she were recalibrating in real time. The authority she had projected at the beginning of the hearing no longer filled the room. It lingered only as an echo, overshadowed by something far more difficult to dismiss, credibility rooted in purpose. When Bondi finally spoke again, her words came sharper, louder, but less assured. She doubled down, invoking familiar language about security, prosperity, and order, but the impact had changed. What once sounded commanding now sounded defensive. She framed herself as the last barrier against chaos, suggesting that Crockett's interpretation of the law was idealistic, impractical, even dangerous. Bondi leaned into urgency, into fear, into the suggestion that restraint weakened leadership. But the chamber no longer responded the way it had before. The room had shifted. Lawmakers listened, but they listened differently. The contrast was now unmistakable. Bondi argued as though power itself justified exemption. Crockett had argued that power demanded restraint. One vision asked the public to trust authority blindly. The other insisted that authority earn that trust through accountability. What unfolded in that chamber was no longer just an exchange between two individuals. It became a mirror reflecting a larger national struggle. One side viewed the law as something to be managed, adjusted, and leveraged by those at the top. The other saw it as a promise made to the people, a line drawn precisely so power could not consume fairness. Bondi represented a political culture built on loyalty upward, where defending influence mattered more than defending integrity. Crockett represented a different approach, one grounded in the belief that democracy survives only when the law remains stronger than those who govern. As the hearing drew to a close, no formal declaration was made about who had won. None was needed. The shift had been visible, undeniable. Bondi may have retained her title and her allies, but Crockett had claimed something far more enduring, moral clarity. Her refusal to match aggression with aggression, her insistence on grounding every argument in purpose rather than power, left an impression that lingered beyond the room. For those watching, both inside the chamber and across the country, the message was unmistakable. Confidence without truth collapses under scrutiny. Authority without accountability erodes trust. The final moments were procedural. The gavel fell. Papers were gathered. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. But the real conclusion had already been written. The image that stayed with observers was not Bondi's raised voice or sharpened accusations. It was Jasmine Crockett sitting calmly, having reminded a room full of lawmakers, and a nation, what the law was actually for. Not to insulate the powerful. Not to excuse corruption. But to protect those without power, without privilege, without a seat at that table. Long after the cameras shut off, that distinction continued to resonate. In a political era crowded with spectacle and division, the confrontation offered something rare: clarity. It showed that the law, when defended with courage and understanding, can still serve as a shield rather than a weapon. And it left behind a question that could not be ignored. When faced with the choice between protecting power and protecting people, which side will define the future? In that chamber, on that day, the answer had been spoken plainly. And no amount of noise could erase it.